Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Jay Hoffmann. Based in New York, by day Jay is lead developer at Reactive Studios, an agile VIP WordPress studio that is one of just 13 WordPress.com VIP service partners globally. Jay is the author of the book, The History of the Web, Volume 1, which you can find at leanpub.com/webhistory. The book is based on Jay's popular History of the Web newsletter, which is based on years of his research into and passion for the web, which presents particular challenges to historians, particularly because of its rapidly changing and in many ways ephemeral nature. You can follow Jay on Twitter at J_Hoffmann, and you can sign up for his newsletter at thehistoryoftheweb.com. In this interview, we're going to talk about Jay's background and career a little bit, starting and maintaining a popular newsletter, his book, and most importantly, of course, the history of the web and the challenges the web presents to historians, some of the more interesting stories that he's researched, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience self-publishing. So thank you, Jay, for being on the LeanPub Front Matter podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in computers.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in New York, not far from where I live right now, a little bit far outside of New York City in a place called Long Island. But interest in computers kind of came really, really early for me. I was kind of playing around with computers in middle school and starting to build my own back when that was like a popular thing to do, or, kind of customize your own computer. I think I actually kind of came into it from the realm of film, which has always been an interest of mine. It's something I studied a little bit. And in my high school, there was actually a film class. It was very, very small. But we had a computer, a few computers, and that's where I learned animation. And from the animations that I created, high school or so, I created my first website to put those out, and people loved it. And then I went to college and I needed some money. And so a few people were able to pay me to make their websites, and then more of that, and graduated college and just kind of kept going. It's interesting because I think when I started, it wasn't a career. I mean, it was something people were starting to do, but it wasn't, I had no awareness that it was a full-time career. And then by the time I got out of college, it was actually starting to become a really refined profession. And so now I've been doing that for a little over a decade now.
And what was your first paid job working on the web?
Yeah, so my first job ever was at Sesame Street, or Sesame Workshop, which is the nonprofit that produces the Sesame Street and a couple other things. Yeah, they actually hired me really early on to work in the marketing department, and I kind of grew there. I got to work with this really great kind of small team that was tailored towards adults, which is obviously that's not the most common Sesame Street use case, but it was fun. And we built, sort of corporate sites, but also kind of a lot of fun experiments over the years. So that's where I started. And after that, I worked at Random House, which is the publishing house. And for the last few years, it's been Reactive Studios, which is a really, really small kind of lean development agency. I've been loving it.
And since it's in the publishing industry, it's, of course, a particular interest to me. What did you do for Random House?
So they maintain a few kind of reader-focused blogs, and my job was basically to maintain those. They were mostly on WordPress, and so a lot of my work was maintaining and developing those sites and creating new features and a couple of more experimental kind of things.
This is, I guess, probably jumping ahead a little bit in terms of, internet timelines, or I should say web timelines. But so you worked for basically a company that produced television shows, and you worked for a company that produced books.
Yeah.
Was there a sense at the time, but not on things that had to do with distributing that content?
Yes.
Their main content specifically over the web. And I'm curious, did you get the sense at either company that they were concerned that the web was a threat to their core business when they started getting into doing these other things?
I've been really fortunate to work with people that have kind of put the web as a foregone conclusion before I even started there. I think Sesame Street in particular is very, very good about embracing the digital generation and sort of the way that things are distributed now. They have a core mission, which is to reach as many kids as possible. And so they look at something like YouTube, or digital platforms or digital experiments as a way of doing that, rather than a hindrance or possibly their business model is they are a nonprofit. So I think they really embraced that. And with Random House, I happen to work with a group of people that was our job, was to explore the fringes of the web and try to figure out, how we can reach people in different ways.
Just going back in time a little bit, one thing I was just reminded of in your story that you sort of politely glossed over, I think, was the sort of humorous nature of your first venture into the web. I've interviewed a couple of people on this podcast, who got their start in mischief. Particularly in school, and so I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing your
sure, yeah. That. It's funny because I've talked to quite a few people about their own origin stories, and I think the most common thing you hear is a band website. After that, it's kind of like fan sites or kind of experimental sites. Mine was in that vein. One of my first few sites was my band's website, which is now defunct, thankfully. Before that, the very first website I ever did actually came when I was in high school. There was a policy that was instituted by our principal that said nobody could wear hoodies during school. I'm still very unclear about why that was the case, but I created
just to interject, people can't see, but Jay's wearing a hoodie right now. Still protesting.
Who knew that one day I would get a job where I could do it all the time? So that was the school policy. So I made a flash animation. It was 15 seconds or 30 seconds that kind of poked fun at the whole idea. And I created the website so that I could tell people, like, hey, go to this website and view this animation. And then from there, I created a few. This is like in the Newgrounds times. I was kind of inspired by that, and a few games and stuff like that.
I think I'll have some questions for you about Flash in the future. Something that I imagine many people listening might not have even heard of, which is actually going to be hopefully a theme that I can touch on, or we can touch on a bit in this podcast. But before we get to the issue of the web, or the subject of the web and its history, I wanted to ask you a little bit about WordPress. I think WordPress is something that I think a lot of people really don't quite grasp its reach. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about some of the ways that WordPress is used that people might not be familiar with.
Sure, yeah. I think some of the biggest confusion around WordPress is probably that there are really two entities when you're dealing with it. It's WordPress.com and WordPress.org is generally how you can think about it. WordPress.com is a kind of site builder in the vein of Squarespace or Wix or something like that. If you've heard of it, it lets you kind of create your own website, buy a domain, all that stuff. It is a service that is run by the creator of the software WordPress, which is hosted on WordPress.org, which anybody it's open source, which means anybody can download it, customize it. There's a whole ecosystem around it. That is the more common use of WordPress, and current estimates put it about 25 to 30% of the web actually runs on top of a WordPress on the WordPress server or software. Yeah, so it's a huge chunk of the web. If you kind of spend any time in the web development world, it's definitely something that you'll hear. It provides a lot of tools for not only creating sites, but at this point it's being used, for applications and all sorts of different things. So, at my agency, we get to do lots of very, very advanced things with WordPress, but the whole idea behind it is you and me, anybody can download it, set up your website. It's got what's called the famous 5-minute install. Like, you can get it kind of up and running in no time. Its core, I think, principle is really to democratize publishing, which it's been fairly successful at doing over the years.
Yeah, I think we might talk a little bit about that subject in a bit as well. Just before we move on to that, can you give an example of an advanced use of WordPress that a studio like yours would work on?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, by that, I mean sort of sites that aren't, I think there's this old thought process that goes along with WordPress that it's really only for simple blogs or simple sites. And what we really create is entire platforms or applications using the software. So it really, runs the gamut.
Yeah. Did the New York Times run on WordPress, or does it still? Do you know?
That's a good question. I know that there's a good chunk of it does. I'm not too sure it's got a lot of different sort of components to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so you started the History of the Web newsletter, I believe, in early 2017.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to begin the
Yeah.
project?
This goes back a while. I mean, so I was a history major in college, and I wrote a few thesis papers and really got into research and what that takes. And it's always been an interest of mine. Generally, when I got out of college, I poked around the history of the web just as a way of, exploring my own passion. And it's a very interesting story. It's fascinating to me because it's so young. I mean, we're still 30 years or under 30 years in terms of how long the web has been around. And yet the sand is constantly shifting beneath our feet, and we're losing things all the time. So I started to just kind of research things and compile a few notes. And I talked to a couple of professors and web practitioners and just people that have been around for a long time. And I increasingly got the sense that nobody was really doing much research about it. I mean, there was a couple of efforts here and there, but there wasn't any kind of concerted effort that I could see. And so I thought about a few different ideas. A book actually early on was an idea that I wanted to explore, but decided that for time reasons and also just to get something out and to start exploring, the question of, is anybody else interested in what I'm interested in, which is, I think, a very common question. I just put out a newsletter and I said, look, I'm going to do the research. I'm going to chunk up that research, and each week I'll pull something out and I'll tell a cool story. And if you like it, subscribe. And that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years. I'm in the kind of process of thinking through a few different ways to expand that. But that's generally been how I came to it. So the research part has been going on for a decade. The writing part of it has been the last couple of years.
Thanks very much for that great explanation.
Yeah.
It leads me to a couple of questions, and it's sort of hard for me to know which to ask in advance because as the challenge as a historian of dealing with something like the internet is, I think, in many ways unique. But I guess before I can talk to you about that, I need to ask you about, let's say, what's the difference between the internet and the World Wide Web?
Yeah, sure. So the internet dates back to more like the 70s, early 80s, and it actually started as a government research project, and I won't get into all the nerdy particulars, but it basically is the pipes that run between computers. It is the way in which computers connect to one another. It is a collection of different technologies that allow computers to talk to one another. The web came a little bit later. It was really early 90s, late 80s, and it was built on top of the internet. It is a layer on top of the internet that makes it easier for me and you to connect to the internet and to, more importantly, and I think this is something we'll definitely talk about, publish on the internet. And there's a few different components to the web that allow it to do that. But I think what's really interesting is that, when it first came out, it was not so clear that the web was going to be the way that everybody connects to the internet, which is mostly true these days. There was a lot of competing protocols, technologies that were emerging at the time that really had some features that the web didn't, but the web had some early advantages that let it overtake it.
Yeah, you write on your website, and I'm just going to do a little quote here. Quote, "The web's history is fairly unique. It is at once extremely ephemeral and still nascent. The web was born as a document-based medium. One of the features of this medium was that documents can disappear, and they often do. So even as the web rapidly advances, pieces of it get lost over time." There's a couple of interesting sort of threads there to pull on, one of which is the sense that the web was born as a document-based medium, invented by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. So I was wondering if you could just take a couple of minutes to tell that story.
Yeah, sure. So CERN, for those that don't know, they're the folks that created the Large Hadron Collider that was finished, I think, a few years ago. They are a physics lab, essentially, based in Switzerland. And so Tim Berners-Lee worked there. He was a computer scientist, and it's an interesting story because he had this dream of the web really early on. I mean, I think by the mid 80s, it was kind of something that he wanted to do. He wanted basically a way for anybody to read something or publish something on the internet. That was kind of his goal. But he knew that CERN wasn't going to just like approve a random project, although they were they're very research based, R&D based. So they'll enable their employees to explore things. So what he did instead was he pitched them a project that allowed everybody in CERN to publish their documentation or to publish their academic papers in a way that was indexable, searchable, easily accessed by anybody on any computer. The biggest problem being that somebody over here might have a Windows machine, someone over here might have a Linux machine, and et cetera. And connecting those computers was a problem. So the web was actually first created as a way for a bunch of academics to share documents with one another, really like essentially a phone book with a few advanced listings on it. And that was how Tim Berners-Lee kind of snuck the idea of the web into CERN. And eventually, a few years later, he convinced CERN, and this is a kind of a huge decision. It was kind of landmark in why we all use the web. He convinced CERN to release it into the public domain, which means nobody owns the web. The web owns the web, and that's what allowed it to sort of spread.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it began, the excuse for it was a phone book, but the reason for it was a library, which is something that I think, people who, we don't really use anything other than our phones for phoning anymore. We don't have separate phone books. And, most of us use the web for all kinds of things besides storing documents or reading sort of something that's formally understood to be distinct as a document. And so it's just very interesting that it had that beginning. So with that stage set, as a historian, how do you go about finding the information that you use as the basis of your newsletter and the content for your book?
So I will say, I did research papers that were from that covered a period of time from 500 years ago, thousands of years ago, things like that, right? So I have a couple of advantages over that. The first being that basically everything I need is digital. It's not all findable because, again, obviously a lot of things have just disappeared over time, although there are kind of ways around that. So that's one advantage I have, is that I can do it from my computer at home. The other advantage being that most of the people that started the web are still alive today and really, really excited about the web. So I've managed to reach out and talk to a lot of people about that, and they've given me a bit of a perspective on what things were like early on and sort of how things have evolved over time. The trick for me is really getting the facts right. There's a lot of opinions. There's not really like a historical record to speak of. So it's really going through people's opinions, going through the way that people saw the web with today's perspective and kind of removing that modern perspective and trying to put that new way of thinking on.
And when it was released to the public by CERN, who were the first people to kind of pick up on the web and start using it?
So, early on, the earliest examples of websites that you'd find were non-commercial academic usage. So you saw a lot of universities just publish a website, which was their own phone book. You saw some government agencies start to publish public records and things like that. They're always looking for new ways to sort of store that. So they would get on the web. But I would say in the first couple of years, what you started to see was people just experimenting a lot. Nobody really knew what we could do and what was possible with the web. So you started to see people there was like a web comic that really early on, this was an academic. It was a professor somewhere, but he also happened to be a cartoonist, and he threw his web comic up on the web, and people really liked that. And then somebody experimented with a magazine, and other people experimented with early animations and things like that. And really by 1995 or so, you started to see web designs and web experiments, and it was this sense of like this indie web, which eventually got glossed over by a real commercialization boom, which is sort of the .com era, which I'm sure we could talk about if you'd like.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. It was, at least for me, quite a challenge to try to think about how to structure this interview, and maybe that's been reflected in a bit of the meandering so far, because there's just so much to try and grasp. And so I guess for the next part of the interview, I'd kind of like to ask about various themes and sort of not just follow random issues through the temporal timeline, but different themes through their timelines. And so, in the beginning was the word. The internet was about text, and it was about looking at texts and communicating with text. When did images and something that there's so many things that we just take for granted, which is I guess kind of what I'm trying to get at in this part of the interview. When was the first image viewable on the web?
So there was a lot of conversation about how media in general should be handled. There was this understanding among the innovators of the web that if it was going to go anywhere, media was going to be a big component of that. And really the reason we didn't see like a lot of images and video early on was bandwidth more than anything else. So the imagination was there. It's just how that was going to be represented was a little bit of a in the air question. So you started to see images pretty early on, but the way that it worked was you would actually like click it and it would open in a new window, right? So the first time you ever saw an inline image, which again is something we see, I don't know, a million times a day and we never even think about, is with the browser called Mosaic, which kind of changed everything. It eventually became Netscape Navigator, which is probably something a lot of people are familiar with. And it is one of the first, Netscape Navigator was the first commercial browser, meaning it was the first browser to be sold, right? All the browsers before that were basically experiments that were cool, but very hard to set up. You needed to have technical know-how to download it, and like you had to run a few commands even just to get it installed on your computer. And then Mosaic came around, and it was like you download it, install it, you can run it on any computer. It's got inline images, which is like insane. It's got colors. It's got all sorts of great things. And then that's where people got a lot of inspiration to start experimenting with the different mediums. So that's in the mid 90s. You're starting to see that.
And did GIFs appear around that time? And is that how the word is pronounced?
Yeah, I say GIFs. I think canonically we can say that. It's funny because it was used because it's a lightweight format. I mean, you can create a GIF and it's incredibly small size. And that's why people used it. And then they were like, hey, you can make things move with it. If you were a web designer or developer in the early days, you probably remember the under construction GIFs and the all sorts of flashing tags and things like that.
And I'm curious about audio. I guess there's two parts to that. One is downloading it from the web, and the other is listening to it on the web.
Yeah.
What could people use Mosaic or Netscape to listen to music?
Download it, yes. I mean, I think so. One of the earliest websites was called the Internet Underground Music Archive, and it actually started as an FTP server in the 80s. But once they saw the web, they were kind of enamored with it, and they moved all of their files to the web. And what it basically was any band in the world could send them files. They would encode those files in such a way that they could be downloaded fairly easily on the web, and then they would put them up for free. And it was just like a way to trade basically underground mixtapes. And you got lots of cool bands kind of coming on and starting out there. That was definitely around.
I had an interesting web experience. I was in Delhi in 1995, and a friend of mine's uncle had a connection at Microsoft, so I got to be at the Indian formal launch of Microsoft Windows 95.
With Internet Explorer.
Yeah. And I remember being totally awestruck by the fact that you could click play and watch a Weezer video. On the computer.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea of when people first could watch video on the web?
On the web, yeah. So there were early attempts to try. You can make downloads available. If anybody remembers the early days of the web, let's say before broadband, you have to sit there for a while to download something. But there was a lot more experiments with interactivity and animation, so like motion on the web in a way that wasn't strictly video. And the idea being that I think a lot of people, even early on, saw the web as it was an interactive medium. So it was something that when you click something, if you had this visceral response, that was eye-opening for a lot of people. When you click something and the the button bounced on the page, and it was like, wow, I've just never seen anything like that. So there was a lot of experiments with motion, with little tiny bits of interactivity. Actually, in the mid to late 90s, you probably saw more experiments with things flashing around the page and jumping in and all sorts of craziness than you do now, because I think web design is a little bit more refined and constrained now, probably much to, I think users tend to like that when they're just trying to get something done. But in the early days, you can make a text bounce all around, or if you could do that, it was like a way of showing off, like, hey, look what this cool thing my website can do.
Yeah, you're reminding me. I just got an email on Comic Sans yesterday, and it's funny. We all make fun of Comic Sans now, but you're reminding me that like there was this playfulness at the beginning of the web that was sort of pervasive. People were, as you say, just so excited to be able to click things and make things happen. I have a philosopher friend who talks about how one of the reasons people love guns so much is that it allows you to do something at a distance. And there's just something really primal about that. And being able to exert your influence on this thing is one of the things that makes the web compelling. Yeah,
I mean, for me, that's what's the most fascinating part of the web for me. And I think a lot of times in the narrative that I'm telling, that kind of my perspective and my opinion on that probably leaks out, because I really do see the turn of the web towards the commercialization as maybe something being lost. I try not to sort of color my entries too much with that, but for me, that sort of early experimentation and that early just innovation was incredible, and it really felt like there were no limits at that time. Like really, we could do anything with this new tool.
Yeah, actually, that leads me to, I guess, the next theme I'd like to cover. So now that we've sort of very briefly covered formats and the various formats that we'd be familiar with on the web, I wanted to talk about commerce. First of all, you actually mentioned this briefly. It used to be that in order to use the web as a sort of normal, non-technical person, you had to go literally put on your coat, put on your shoes, and go to the store and buy a piece of cardboard shrink wrapped with a disk in it that contained the software that you were going to use, and then you had to go home and you had to install it. When did that era end?
Yeah, so Microsoft actually changed that. They bundled a browser in Microsoft Internet Explorer, which I'm sure everybody is likely somewhat familiar with. They bundled it for free in their operating system. So when you downloaded Microsoft, you got Internet Explorer for free. It was actually the subject of a lawsuit, antitrust lawsuit, because the question was, if they're giving away their browser for free, then are they monopolizing basically the internet?
I'll just for a moment, I'll actually be that another theme will be government. So let's talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, of course. But when Internet Explorer came out, it changed a lot. I think Netscape was still the most popular browser at the time. There was a few technologies that were needed in order to make something like commerce available even, or possible, let's say. And Internet Explorer and Netscape were the first to actually explore those technologies. So by the sort of late 90s, mid to more like late 90s, you really started to see a lot of advanced technologies enter the browser and new capabilities, which enabled kind of the next generation of websites.
So it was probably around the late 90s that people could start actually like entering credit card numbers and buying things on the internet?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, Amazon was around in 95, eBay 96, 97. So even before, you wouldn't enter your credit card on it. It would be more of like a bank transaction, or you would mail people things. There's all sorts of ways of doing things even without the technologies. But by that point, you actually started to see technologies which enabled secure transactions online. I mean, that's the most important part, is that when I enter my credit card, it doesn't get hijacked on the way over to the website. So, by the late 90s, you did start to see that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Most people take that kind of security for granted nowadays. I mean, we have the concept of hacks and stuff like that, which I'll talk about later, but like the kind of having your credit card number stolen at the point of the transaction is something we're not more or less concerned about anymore. And it reminds me, I remember explaining to one of my aunts once that, she wanted to buy something, and I was like, oh, you could just go online and buy it and they'll bring it to your house. And she said, no, I would never put my credit card number on the computer. And to this day, I regret explaining to her that actually, your credit card number is already on computers all over the world. That's how credit card companies work now. And her eyes were just wide and with horror at this idea. But it is interesting that, over time, these technologies have become that. I mean, there's so many things that have become commonplace, but in particular, secure, at least at time of transaction, use of credit cards is something that is only about 20 years old.
Yeah, for sure. And I distinctly remember that too, like sort of starting to figure out how to buy things on the internet, and people were being very fearful of that. And it's not a concern at all anymore.
Another thing that related to the commerce that is commonplace now is using the internet using the web, I should say, to do your banking.
Yeah.
Do you know when banks first started getting into the web?
I think you just gave me a really interesting topic to explore that I really haven't. I could tell you that, that banks, they were starting to have websites early. I mean, pre-2000, but there wasn't a concept of online banking yet. I would have to think that came post-2000, after the dot-com bubble, that you started to see stuff like that. But I don't have a ton of details on that.
Well, we'll look forward to subscribe to your newsletter, and everybody listening should sign up. We'll look forward to hopefully hearing about that in the future. That's another thing that's just such a basic part of our lives now. I mean, I can manage accounts. Anyone can manage accounts all around the world, from your phone even very easily now. But there were, I imagine just huge battles fought against all kinds of enemies, internal and external, by banks in order to make that a reality. You mentioned the .com bubble.
Sure.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because the web had this impact on commerce in all kinds of crazy ways that sort of became a kind of perfect storm in the late 90s. And so one of my little hobby horses about the .com crash that happened around 2001 that people rarely address is the opportunity for people to buy and sell stocks online became a thing. Mm-hmm. Before that, you kind of had to have a certain kind of expertise or just initiation into the process of buying and selling stocks. But all of a sudden, in the late 90s, you could sign up for an account and you could see these dynamic charts changing in real time. You didn't need your own Bloomberg terminal or anything like that. And so one thing that happened was the bubble that happened around companies that, at the time you just put like .com at the end of if you had a website that was the name of the object you were selling or the market you were selling into, all of a sudden you could have an IPO and be worth billions of dollars. It was nuts. And one of the things that drove that was online trading. I had a friend, I have friends who lost tens of thousands of dollars on various sort of schemes because they just saw everything going up and up and up until it went down. And of course, what the online trading did was it allowed the companies to IPO, and then that just sort of became this cycle that built and built and built until it came down. I guess I'm not sure if I even really have a question to ask after saying that. But I guess let me try and transition that into another question, which is, when did it become possible to start your own web-based company without needing to buy and maintain your own servers?
Right. Yeah, that was a big turning point. You started to see that. Honestly, you didn't really see that until into the .com era, which is, 1998, 1999, 2000 is when basically what happened was any company that they were called .com. So it's literally any company that had a .com was all of a sudden worth 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times what they would be if they were like a brick and mortar store or just like a normal agency. So you saw like digital agencies like Razorfish with, $100 million, $200 million worth of investment. There's a story where there was a site called iVillage, which is it's a community site tailored mostly for women. And it was at its peak valuation. It was valued at more than General Electric, which is just insane. And, the founders of the sites kind of knew that it was crazy, but what happened was there was this surge of investment, and eventually there were no business models behind any of these sites, and they weren't making money, and they just hemorrhaged all this money. And that's where you get a bubble burst, and you got a bit of a crash in 2001-ish. So even at that point, one of the costs of doing business was creating your own servers, and you had these in-house IT people that were maintaining them for a company of most sizes. But what you did start to see was a little bit of like time sharing networks. So these like big companies, that oil companies or something like that, would have these servers that would just run, would, let's say, not need to run anything during the summer, or they would not run anything overnight. They would actually lend out the servers for people to use. And that was like a way of hosting various networks and things like that. So you did start to see that. But if you were, let's say, pets.com, which is, I think, one of the most famous examples of a .com company, you definitely had like a basement full of servers, or likely an offsite server farm, essentially. And there were plenty of people on staff that were actually tasked with just maintaining those, which is, you saw a lot of outages at that point because people didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't know what would happen if 1 million people visited your site in a day. So they were still kind of figuring that out.
That actually leads me into the next sort of theme I'd like to cover, which is we've talked about, the file formats and all the things that's enabled. We've talked about commerce and some of the various dimensions to that. One of the things the web has introduced into our lives is some bad things that we just take for granted. One of which is distributed denial of service attacks.
Yeah.
Do you recall when that became a phenomenon, where people would basically, malicious actors would deliberately flood a website with a lot of attention, essentially, in order to shut it down?
Yeah, I mean, to this day, I think the intentions behind it are unclear at best, right? So to overload a server to the point of taking it down, there's not really a business case for it. It really is a malicious attack. So it could just be people that think it's funny, right? Which is unfortunately like a good amount of the bad that happens on the web is for that reason. It could be a more calculated attack, which sometimes happens as well. I think you don't really start to see that. I mean, hacking goes back to computers, right? I mean, literally with basically the first computers, there were all sorts of different ways to, both with good intentions and with bad intentions, sort of hack computers. You don't really start to see that though until bots become really popular. I think that's only in the last 15 years or so that people have taken the idea of making a computer literally a robot that operates on the web with malicious intent and aggregating that to, the millions and billions that we kind of see today. So it's you're probably seeing it more now than ever, and it's something that's only very recently, maybe in the last decade, matured to the point of being very, very calculated.
It's a really fascinating thing. So, hacking and things like that existed before the web, but most people got onto the internet because of the web.
Right.
And that's the reason they got exposed to things like the subject of my next question, which is viruses. It's something that I think a lot of us aren't as concerned about now as we used to be. Because, fortunately, not only technology on the good side has advanced, but also people's habits and sort of awarenesses have improved. Do you recall when was the first sort of big virus that came into public consciousness? And perhaps, I don't know, maybe to narrow it down, I mean, I don't expect you to be able to answer this question precisely, but the first time there was a news headline about people getting hit by a virus.
I can tell you one thing I've written about in the past, and to me it's very interesting because it happens in the specter of Y2K, which is, again, something I don't think people think about day to day, but Y2K was this whole idea that, like, at the turn of the century, literally on January 1st, 2000, because of the way that computers were programmed, they were programmed with dates that only had the last two digits, so like 89, 90, 91, and that when 2000 turned over, like, that every server in the world was going to crash and banks were going to lose all of our money and nukes were going to launch, and nothing happened. I think there was like 2 reported instances of like a gas pump malfunctioning, something like that. But that one that was all over the press, right? And then I want to say a few months later, right, we got something that was called the I Love You virus. And it's fascinating to me because the viruses themselves aren't all that technically advanced, right? They're their goal is to get you to download them. And when you download them, they do something pretty simple. With the I Love You virus, the reason that it spread, and it really did spread, was because it was bundled in an email that said, I love you, right? That was the subject line. And that preyed on people's natural inclinations and instincts and kind of curiosity. And it was self-replicating. So what it did was it would invade your computer. So you would download it. It would invade your computer. It would start, I think, duplicating or removing all of the files on your computer. And then it would go to your contact list, and it would send that exact same email to everybody that you had stored on your computer. And that would spread and spread and spread. And government agencies had to shut down because all of a sudden 30% of the computers in their, in the agency had downloaded this virus. I think that remains true of hacking today, in that the most elaborate hacking techniques have very little to do with like technical proficiency and much more to do with what's known, I think, these days as like social engineering, which is how can we prey on people's human side in order to trick them into downloading or getting a virus.
Yeah, speaking of the human side in email, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. One thing, to this day, my parents, I'm going to pick on my parents a little bit. I love them very much. They have a landline telephone, and they will answer it whenever it goes off. And I sort of kind of find it both cute and kind of interesting at the same time, because it's a remnant. That behavior is a remnant of a time when if you missed a phone call, you really missed it. And so there was something very kind of, you really needed to answer the phone when it went off, usually, basically. And also, you knew that on the other end of the line was a human being who knew your number, who was calling you. And so when they get a communication from someone that way, they just assume there's a real person on the other end of it. And when email came out, people related to email the same way. If you got an email from in your inbox, that said I love you, that said anything, business opportunity, you might not have been naive about like the content of it, but most people just naturally related to it. Like, this is a person who knows me, who's a real human being, who's contacting me specifically. And so my specific question on that is, do you remember, or do you know when the Nigerian prince scam emerged?
I don't.
Which is something people may not remember.
No, I can't tell you an exact date on that, unfortunately. I can tell you email spam predates the web, actually. The first incident of email spam, because email also predates the web by nearly a decade. So one of this guy actually got in a lot of trouble. It was still a small community of like internet people, and he was like throwing a party essentially, but like a networking event, and he spammed everybody. And that was like the first, everybody that he could get his hands on email got this like random email, and it was a break in trust, and people were still operating under the landline assumption of, if I get an email, it's because my email, and this is a correspondence between just the two of us. There wasn't an expectation that you would get something like a newsletter, for instance, or, in his case, like a spam. So he got banned from a whole lot of mailing lists and things like that for trying something like that. But obviously we couldn't curb the tide. So I'm not exactly sure when that stuff started, but I can tell you that with every technology, spam is early. It's always early. People are trying to figure that stuff out.
Another bad thing that we're accustomed to in our day-to-day lives now is online shaming.
Yeah.
Shaming, of course, is nothing new, but the ability to, say, send out a tweet and get on an airplane and then get off the plane and realize your life's been ruined is something that we all witness, almost on a daily basis now. Do you have any idea of when that became a thing? I know these questions I'm throwing at you are actually quite random from your perspective, so thank you for being so game. But, there are examples of things that would happen, like in offices, emails would start going around where someone had written, say, a cruel email or a stupid email or just said something dumb. Yeah. And then those would leak out of the company that they originated in. And then suddenly everyone around the world would be like, oh my God, look at what this person did. Do you have any idea about when that became a phenomenon?
So, on a personal note, I'd say this is, to me, it's one of the biggest failures of the web, is that behavior like that, and to be honest, like the shaming is probably the least, let's say abusive or harmful version of that. But there's a few other kind of things that are done on the web that stem from that. And I think what happened was early on, and even pre-web, there was this sense that in a community, there was layers of protection. And one of those layers, for instance, was that everyone was anonymous, which I think is really funny because I think on Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, there's this assumption that if everybody was anonymous, we'd be all spamming each other all the time, and that there'd be like all this, there'd be a lot of this abusive behavior, which, by the way, we see plenty of anyway. But actually, being anonymous was also a defense mechanism, right? It allowed you, like, if I tweeted something out, you couldn't then find my address, right, and send a SWAT team, for instance, or something like that. So you could come out with your identity if that was something that you were comfortable doing, but you could also hide behind this kind of veil of anonymity. There was also this idea that growth and community should be small, that growth should be deliberate, and that every person should be protected and feel safe, and that banning wasn't banning somebody from the community because they were being harmful to it wasn't seen as like a violation of free speech. It was seen as a way of protecting the community from bad actors, essentially. And, starting with the .com era and continuing on until today, the goal shifted. So your goal became not how can I foster a community that feels safe and inclusive and big, but, perhaps not for everybody, right? And some of the earliest social media sites like Black Planet and Asian Avenue were actually tailored for certain communities, for people of color specifically. And then you got Facebook and MySpace, and a few Friendster sort of started the trend, and the idea became, how can we get everybody? I want everybody in the world to be on my network. And what that did was it made it impossible to control and to moderate and to anybody can join, right? Anybody can come in, and the mechanisms for creating an account became so simple, right? You didn't have to pay, you didn't have to do anything. You just need an email address. It became so simple that creating fake accounts became possible, and creating pseudo-anonymous accounts. So now the bad people can hide behind anonymity, but the people that are trying to protect themselves cannot, for instance. So you started to see that shift, I think, in the mid 2000s with this sort of, this idea that the goal of every website should be, how can I reach 1 billion people? How can I reach more than 1 billion people? Rather than, how can I keep people on my site? How can I create an engaging and thoughtful and sustainable community? I think it's unfortunate. I don't think it's the fault of any one site or any one person or any one moment in time. It's just the general commercialization of the web made that inevitable, right? Because the idea was, if you can get lots of people, you can get lots of money, and that's mostly bore out to be true. Bottom line is, though, you can run a website for, at this point, I don't know. I mean, you can run a website for $100, a year, let's say, and so I don't know why you need $1 billion a year in revenue in order to run a community. You really don't. But that became the goal, and I think attitudes started to shift.
Yeah, that I think hopefully I'll get a chance to ask you about the huge issue of the public and the private, and the way that's changed our lives online. But before perhaps moving on, I wanted to ask you about another, what I'll characterize as a negative thing about the web that touches on what you just talked about, which is, in order to get and keep 1 billion people on your site, companies deploy constantly methods of fucking with you.
Yeah.
It's just like, and I'm going to pick specifically on Facebook here.
Sure.
Facebook is a company comprised of people fucking with you. They're given an assignment. They're like, increase the number of interactions with this part of Facebook. And when you open it up, particularly on the web, and you look at it, if you understand what's going on behind it, it's like behind each little part of the 150 ways of interacting with that website is a one or two, maybe even more, or often more people who are just sitting around all day being monitored by the company itself for the the results of their actions and fucking with you. And so just, and I'm going to get a little bit mad here because it really does impact our lives. And so, for example, Facebook used to be one thing on your phone. Then it became two, Facebook and Messenger. And I turned off notifications for Facebook because they're useless. And they're just there to kind of hit me and make me click on something. But I kept Messenger notifications because at least I knew that was a human being trying to communicate with me. And then one day, not too long ago, all of a sudden I got essentially a Facebook notification, like through Messenger notifications saying you've been friends with so-and-so for 10 years. Is there any way forward that you can see on this general topic of what you were saying, like the companies don't need to be doing what they're doing to actually run good communities, but at the same time, they're extremely successful and a lot of people spend all day on them?
Yeah. So I hear anger in your voice. I think you're not alone. It makes me angry. I think it makes a lot of the creators of the web. It makes a lot of the people that understand what's going on, and even a lot of people, and that number, by the way, of people that do understand what's going on, it's increasing every day. But it makes a lot of people angry. I think I could say a few things about it. One is that there's a competing theories on this, which is that have we entered a time when the biggest internet companies of today, Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc., are now institutions, kind of like General Electric or, just behemoth companies that, let's say, aren't going away for the next 100 years? Or is it possible that we can enter a time when there is no Facebook anymore, when literally the tide shifts to a point? I mean, it happens all the time on the web. It literally happens every 5 to 10 years where there's just a seismic shift and something different comes around. I don't know if that's possible, right? Because we've entered a phase where it's a given. It's a given that, like, you have a Facebook account. It's essentially like having an ID, right? It works and operates in a similar way, and they know that, and they are preying on that for sure. But I optimistically like to imagine a day in which that whole paradigm is upended, right? I think there's this idea that they'll be around for the next 50 years, let's say, but there's no proof of that. I mean, we're 30 years into the web. There's no way to tell what the next step might be. There's an entire new generation that understands the dangers that come with everybody being on the same place in a way that our generation just doesn't understand. And they're going to build solutions that accommodate that. And you're starting to see that, unfortunately, with the same old business models. But there's going to be hackers of a new generation and again, this is my optimism speaking. There are plenty of people that say that I would, and much smarter than me, that are saying I'm wrong. But I like to think that that we'll start to see people use the web to create more open, more inclusive, less centralized tools that enable maybe a more fractured landscape, but certainly, I guess just a better one. So I think if we stay on the path we're on right now, it's only going to get worse, and it is going to get worse. I mean, there's no question of that. It's getting worse all the time. But I like to be optimistic and think that it's overturnable.
Maybe moving on to a lighter subject for the next, because there is so much fun. It's sort of easy to get lost, but there's so much fun on the internet as well. We touched on it earlier, but I'd like to talk about things that are gone now and things that we have now. Things that are gone now, I mean, in a sort of spirit of nostalgia. So, and I guess I'm mostly referencing the developed world here, but that's not so true anymore. What were internet cafes, and when did they get started? So this is things that are gone now.
Yeah. So the exact time, I'd actually have to check my website, but I did write a story about internet cafes. They're fascinating to me. Um, they got started, they really didn't get started until the web got started, even though technically they weren't constrained to just the web. So there's a lot of like internet cafes, for instance, that are tailored towards internet games, even early on, or internet chat rooms. Um, what was kind of really interesting was that, I mean, so internet access in the early days was not like it is today, where it's like a very, very, I mean, it's fairly low, at least in the United States, it's fairly low monthly fee, gets you connected to the web. And obviously it's on our phones and things like that. But getting connected was not as simple in the early days. And so these internet cafes took that idea and they basically made the internet and the web available to everybody, and you could just come in and you basically pay by the hour and just like do whatever you wanted on the internet. But they actually became these like centers of social activity. So you started to see like early versions of what are now basically meetups, where people would meet every week and just like chat, or you started to see kind of people come together around different technologies or like create new projects inside of these cafes. I mean, it's interesting because we're incredibly social these days on the web, and yet we don't really have a community anymore. And just literally being in the same physical space created that. And there's this fascinating component of it, which I wrote about, which is that there used to be these webcams, and they would put them in the internet cafes, right? And then so when you were away from the internet cafe, you can sit and you can watch like what was going on in your internet cafe of choice, right? And you literally just like sign on to the internet in order to get a window into your internet life that was, in many ways physical and social. So they're actually still very, very popular, and they're a little bit different, but they are still very popular in Korea, for instance. But you don't really see them these days in the U.S. or Europe.
One of the things that we have now is memes.
Yeah.
Can you recall what some of the one or two of the first memes were? I think one might
Yeah.
have been the dancing baby.
Yeah, Dancing Baby was really early on. It was an animation experiment. If anybody doesn't remember it, it's literally a dancing baby. It was on Ally McBeal. It was like a big deal. I think there were a bunch of sites that were meme factories, and was their goal, right? But there's sites like DeviantArt and Newgrounds that were all about creating like these kind of spreadable viral content, which is really just for fun, especially in the beginning. And the nice thing about memes is they've kind of retained that. I mean, there's ways to weaponize, I think, memes, but in general, it's still just like a way of having fun on the internet. It like requires, in order to understand a meme, it requires a sort of inside baseball knowledge of a lot of different things simultaneously, which is just endlessly fascinating, I think. And that was true even in the early days. So there was these like fun games or just short videos and things like that it was the kind of thing that's like, I get, my parents don't get, and that's why it's cool. And I think that continues to be true.
One thing we don't have anymore is video stores, more or less. Do you have any thoughts about at what point the sort of tipping point came?
Recently, I think more recently than you might think. I think obviously with now with Netflix and Hulu and all sorts of streaming platforms, we've been able to move things online. It was only in the last 5 years or so that even we had like the broadband capacity in order to do that. I mean, it's a crazy number of data that Netflix all alone is exchanging every day through the pipes of the internet. So yeah, I mean, there were lots of experiments with it. I mean, one of Microsoft's earliest experiments was to create like an online news channel, essentially. Like they wanted to create these little videos online, and that actually eventually became MSNBC, like the cable channel, which is Microsoft NBC. MSN was their network. So everybody that tried in like the 90s and early to mid 2000s was just ahead of their time, and it just didn't take off. So there were experiments, but I think we only just got there recently.
One of the things that we do have now is easy, truly working and dependable video calling.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of when we turned the corner on that? Because that also seems to me to be actually more recent than it might seem, because it's just so robust now.
If I have a sense of it, it's really only because like I've been doing video calls for the last decade, and I remember what it was like at the beginning, and there were like dropouts, and it was really fuzzy, and there's a lot to deal with. So again, I think that the issues here are mostly with like just bandwidth and just the infrastructure part is something that I'm aware of. I don't have like a lot of knowledge about, so I can't speak too much about it.
Going back to big, serious things, for the next part of the interview, the theme I'd like to talk about is government. You brought up earlier on that governments got involved with the web when Microsoft started including Internet Explorer for free with its operating system. Now, of course, governments have been involved since the beginning. The Internet itself was a government project. The web came from CERN, which was funded by various governments itself. But do you have a sense of when governments first started seeing the web as something to regulate?
Yeah, I mean, one of the earliest examples of regulation, the Microsoft case is an early attempt at that, although it was really more focused on whether or not Microsoft was becoming a monopoly, and it was an antitrust suit, which Microsoft won, kind of. But one of the earliest, sort of attempts to regulate was a law. It was called COPA, Children's Online Protection Act, and it's basically a way to ensure that when children are online and viewing things, we're not collecting data about them. And there's a lot more rules. And I actually have some experience with this after, working at Sesame Street. There are a lot more rules when you're building a website that's tailored for children that you can get fined or you can get your site taken down if you don't follow them than there are for building a site for adults. That was in the late 90s, you started to see that. And then more recently, you've seen a lot more, maybe going the other way, things like SOPA, which sort of attempt to regulate what can and can't be on the web, which it's a tricky territory, right? Because you do want to protect people's intellectual property to the extent that you believe in a concept like that. But you also want to be, the web is a decentralized open platform, and to sort of infringe on that is to threaten its very existence. So it's been interesting because I think we're in a period of time right now when there's a lot of people that would welcome government intervention, myself included, in terms of, especially in issues related to privacy and things. But there's a the government moves slow and the internet moves fast, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about how the internet works, and I think we just need to be careful about what goes on there.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. While preparing for this podcast, I listened to another podcast, one that was published recently, Two Girls, One Podcast. It's a really good episode. And in that episode, you talk about being a supporter of GDPR. The General Data Protection Regulation. That was sort of big news around mid-2018, if I recall. I might actually have the whole year wrong, but I had to become formally sort of chief data protection officer.
I'm sure that affected LeanPub.
And I wanted to ask you, what is it about? I mean, there are lots of complexities around it, but what is it about it? If you could speak at a general level that you're in favor of.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the most important part about GDPR, never mind the, let's say, execution of it, is that it puts users back in control of their data. So if my data is up on a site, I can request to have that data removed completely. Like if I should be able to tell Facebook, like, I don't want you to have any of my activity, any of my friends, nothing I've ever done. I want you to delete it from your servers. It offers really, really intense technical challenges because it's not something people have thought about. But I'm massively in favor of giving people the mechanisms needed in order to in order to have some control over how their data is being propagated and used across these massive advertising networks and social networks. I think if you take that and you combine it with digital literacy and education, then you start to have a much more informed consumer, and just you start to have people that sort of take control of their digital lives a little bit. And I think that in the long run, it can help solve some of these privacy issues like ahead of time.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating issue that you touched on there. The way that it's meant to give people a sense of control over what's happening to them in their lives. And I think this is somewhat related to my rant about being fucked with earlier. But I remember not too long ago, I moved to a new city and I found a place to buy cookware, and I gave them my email address. And when I got home and fired up Google, there was cookware advertisements in my search results for
so many stories like that, store. Right? Yeah.
And I really felt fucked with. And although there are many things about, particularly as you say, about the execution of GDPR and the communication to the public about it that may have been imperfect, it was in many ways, it was a response to the fact that, people were feeling like, oh, it's not just happening on the web anymore. It's like I go to a store and something I do there has an impact on, like verbally, something I do there then has an impact on my life. So on that note, and you brought up copyright earlier, one of the controversies of the past year around the web was something called Article 13 in the EU's copyright directive. Is that something you followed and that you have?
Not really, but if please explain it to me, because it sounds.
Yes. Yeah. So the controversy was that that Article 13, for the purpose of protecting copyright, might actually force everyone in the world using the internet would have to place a filter on anything they upload to it, essentially. Mm-hmm. And this would be not just the internet, not just the web. It would be anything you're putting out there should go through a filter to check to see if it contains copyrighted material. And that to me brings up, this is a bit of a digression, I suppose, but this is an old battle between companies that own intellectual property and people who want to listen to music or watch movies or make memes and things like that. And I remember, I don't think this is an invented memory, there was a time when organizations that represent people who own intellectual property wanted to install in all computers software that would look at what you're doing and prevent you from doing things that they didn't want you to do. So for an example would be, if you're running video, installed like in the hardware is something that, allows that can check to see if you're looking at something that's been pirated. So is this, do you see this battle continuing, I suppose, would be why asking that question?
So I mean, I could tell you one of the hotly contested debates of now is the W3C, which is the organization that sort of regulates and maintains the standards of the web, and not in a formal way, like they can't force anybody to do anything, but it's a way for a bunch of browsers and websites and stakeholders to get together and like basically talk about the future of the web. And one of the things that they're debating right now is whether or not to introduce DRM into the web. Right. So right now, when you view something on like Netflix or Hulu, they're using all this like weird proprietary technology as a way of preventing you, the consumer, from downloading that or like kind of, taking that. And there's a lot of opinions on both sides. I personally, if I'm just going to like throw my opinion out, I'm a WordPress developer. I believe very deeply in open source and Creative Commons and sort of open content like that. I think DRM would endanger the web in ways that maybe we don't see right now. I think if you're interested in opinions about that in particular, I think Cory Doctorow is probably the person talking about it the most these days. All of which is to say that yes is the answer. This is going to be a question. I think it's taken a back seat for a little while because there's these much larger issues going on with the web and the internet in general that are kind of being debated in public spaces. But eventually we'll come back to this DRM question and just copyright in general and how copyright and intellectual property is managed online.
Yeah, there's a really interesting example I like to bring up when having this argument. My opinion, just, to throw it out there, is that, I think basically I'm very much against DRM in all circumstances.
Yes.
The analogy I like to use is, imagine if every parcel you sent, or in the olden days, paper letter that you sent, were inspected to see if there was something copyrighted in there that you hadn't paid for. Nobody, except maybe the, Motion Picture Association, would approve of something like that, because we understand the implications of having everything we do inspected in that way in the physical realm.
Yeah.
But there's a lingering sense that I think, and I think this is, I'm going to make maybe a controversial claim, this really is a deep generational thing, where some people just relate to what happens on the computer like it's not real in the way other things are real.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter in the way that other things matter. And this manifests itself in things like, senators in the United States who boast about being unable to email.
Yes. I think, there is a weird concept. I think it started because you really used to have this whole, you would talk about your digital life with like wonderment and amazement. Like, I have this fantastic digital life. And I think over time that wonder faded away, but there was still this idea that there's a digital life and there's a real life. And that's a concept that continues to this day. I think sometimes I'll talk to, let's say my parents or my in-laws, and they'll be like, well, why are they putting these stupid pictures on the internet, or why are you putting your business out there, kind of thing. And me, people I know, like our whole generation, and honestly, the generation under me is even I guess worse, you would say, right? But the concept, I think, is interesting because I understand privacy and public, the idea of public and private, in a way that my parents didn't, and the generation under me understands public and private in a way that I don't. And there's this kind of sense that that everything is public by default, and it's not. It's because our digital lives are our real lives. So everything in our real lives emanates out into the digital world and becomes public, and you should operate accordingly, basically. I wrote recently about Dana Boyd, the researcher. She currently works, I believe, at Microsoft, but she's done research for the last 20 years on the web and the internet and all sorts of interesting things. I highly recommend just checking out anything by her. But she has this concept of super publics, which is really the idea that when we say something online right now, we are saying it always. We are saying it for forever in the future. We are saying it to everybody simultaneously at once. And obviously, in practice, that's not necessarily true, but theoretically it is. And there's all sorts of techniques that the younger generation is developing. I think one of the memes is a really interesting example of this. It's like a way of communicating with one another in a way that is coded to the extent that like people actually can't understand it unless they're in on the reference. If you ever watch like a teenager use Snapchat, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's basically they're communicating in a way that is foreign. I think Dana Boyd refers to it as social stenography, which is this idea that like it's coded. It's essentially coded for just the generation. You're going to start to see more of that. I think you're going to start to, obviously digital natives are now in their 30s and 40s. So, you're just going to start to see that concept of public, I think, and private shift. And that's why, I said before, I'm very hopeful about what could be done once that's kind of just like a foregone conclusion. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I read that great post that you wrote, and I'll definitely link to it in the transcription for this interview. It leads me to try and touch on something I guess might be a good way to end this part of the interview, which is this idea that there's no distinction between public and private for, let's say, people born in the last 20 years or so, in the way that there used to be in the past. And so one thing you write about, for example, is the fact that anything you do online can be screenshotted, for example.
Right.
This became a sort of Colbert Report joke when he was interviewing the founders of Snapchat, where they're like, yeah, it disappears. And he's like, can anybody just take a screenshot of it? And they were both like, if I remember correctly, I might be inventing this, but they both kind of went red and were like, yeah. But there's a saying in sort of business and publicity as well that don't ever send an email that you don't want the whole world to see, because even if it's somehow in a network where it can't be forwarded out of there, it can be shared with anyone else in that network, and it can be screenshotted, and then that can be spread around. And if it's believable, people will believe it, or even if they it's not believable, some people will believe it. And this might seem like an odd thing to bring up, but it reminded me of a story I was told by someone in DC who just had a child born, and they'd been looking into schools, and one of the schools they looked at gave all the kids iPads, and one of the things that the kids did with the iPads was record themselves giving reports so that they could then watch themselves afterwards and then refine their performance.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And I just think there's a really interesting shift that's happened, and this is very recent, that this reality that we've faced about the lack of a distinct, the sort of possibility of anything you do online becoming public at some point, like instantly, which is one kind of danger, or like 20 years later, which is another kind of danger. This is actually now true in public as well, because anything you do could be recorded either by a camera that's fixed to a building, or that's being held by a person. So do you see, are you optimistic about the new let's say the new generation dealing with that issue?
My short answer is yes, right? And I don't want to speak about things that I necessarily don't have a lot of expertise on, right? But I think it's a net positive. I think this idea that everything is public is exposing a lot of things, which is why we're starting to see, it's one of the reasons we're starting to see movements around, sort of upending old social orders and exposing people for who they truly are and things like that. So I think ultimately that part of it is a net positive. I also think I am always optimistic about the social aspect. I think there's a lot of this idea of get off your computer, get off your phone, and go outside, which, let's say from a biological perspective, I guess does make sense, right? You can't just sit on the couch all day. But I do think that that's a misunderstanding of the current mode of how people operate, in that our social lives are very much online, and that you're starting to see kids, younger kids and teenagers and just people that are experimenting and opening up their eyes to new perspectives, really early on. Reaching out to communities and understanding the world in a way that, maybe they wouldn't even get a chance to do until college or later normally. And so they're importantly talking to people that aren't like them, with perspectives that aren't like theirs, and trying things out, not feeling constrained by the way that things currently operate. So I think in that sense, that part is a net positive. Obviously, there's plenty of negatives that come with it, and I think those are being well covered, and we need to think about them constructively. But I like to remain optimistic about it.
I'm going to take the opportunity on that somewhat optimistic note to move on to the next part of the last part of the interview. I would like to say there are lots of things I brought up we'll be talking about later in this interview that we didn't get to touch on. One of those was publishing. But your book is called, The History of the Web Volume 1, so maybe we'll have a chance to have another interview and cover those topics when your second volume comes out. But for the last part of the interview, when I'm interviewing a LeanPub author, I always like to talk to them about their experience self-publishing a little bit, because quite a few of the listeners to this podcast are authors themselves or people who are considering publishing books. So I guess my first question is, why did you choose to publish your book on LeanPub?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about doing kind of an ebook for a little while, and it's something that I've had requested from a few different people, and so I've thought about it. I've been giving away this content for free for the last 2 years, and I did want to make it available to people, but I think I've also been asked, how can I support you? People like to throw me, a few dollars, or just kind of show that they are very interested, or they want me to keep going with it. And it's my promise I will be keeping going with it for a while. But I researched a few different things, and then for me, the biggest draw to LeanPub was like the ability to kind of set a price so that people, if they wanted to, like I've had a few people that contributed because they're really just contributing to me in the ongoing project rather than, and the ebook is a very nice keepsake. It's a way for them to, to hold on to that content and kind of read it independent of their email inbox. So that was one draw. And the other being that it's the only tool I found ebook publishing wise that basically allows you to take massive quantities from a blog and convert it into an ebook really simply. And then, again, I'm very much in favor of openness and things like that. So I like that there's this, like, I can just download my files. There's no, it's not like, if I published on Amazon, for instance, like that would be locked into their sort of network. So mixture of reasons, I guess. Yeah.
Speaking of openness, actually, that reminds me, there was just an article that I read yesterday. I think it might have been published yesterday on Vox about a little mini scandal in the book publishing world that's going on right now, where someone well known in journalism had a book come out, or at least had early drafts of a book circulated that appeared to have a lot of errors in it. Factual errors in it. And this article on Vox is about the fact that the conventional publishing workflow more or less leaves fact-checking to the author. And if they have a staff, perhaps someone in the publishing company. Now, one of the interesting things is that would seem to imply for a self-published author that, oh no, you're doubly screwed because you don't even have the veneer or the possibility of sort of a team fact-checking you.
Yeah.
But the thing about LeanPub in particular is that it's not just a technology; it's also a publishing workflow philosophy, and it's got a built-in because you can easily update things and because you can publish in progress. The fact checking happens organically as you reach out to your audience. Is that something that you've experienced?
So, fact checking for me is extremely important. So every single one of my entries has a list of sources. Whenever possible, I literally try to verify it with people that live the experience that I'm discussing. So it's important to me generally. I think with LeanPub, what was nice for me was I can basically converted my blog into Markdown files, which gave me a way to go through everything. Once again, I was able to actually find a few things and clean up a few things. And I managed to rearrange the order of things as well to make it chronological, which is not how I do the newsletter. I think for me, being able to quickly preview things was massive. I just generated a PDF and checked it out. So it gave me a chance to review, and it's something that I'm obsessed about anyway.
And have readers contacted you with errors that they found?
Sure.
Is the most direct thing. Yeah.
It's the web. I've been so fortunate because I have been contacted many, many times, never with malicious intent, never sort of in a patronizing way, always helpful. I have a friend that basically Twitter messages me every few weeks with typos. So then it ranges from that to, people that are like, hey, I lived what you just talked about and you got this a little bit wrong. And so I always go back and kind of fix those up. And I've managed to have great conversations from those. So I encourage it always.
It's great to hear you say that. I mean, that is consistent with what we've heard over the years from a lot of different authors in a lot of different areas. I mean, one of the sort of canonical types of books to be published on LeanPub is programming books. And if someone's got some code snippet in there that actually doesn't work anymore or didn't work at all, readers love. They not only love contacting authors and hearing back from authors, they love helping make the books better, and they particularly love seeing a change that they pointed out
sure.
Made to the actual book. And it's something that I think a lot of people are actually they're a little bit scared when they publish something that they're going to get this negativity. They're going to get negative interactions, patronizing interactions, attacks, and I can't make any guarantees, but for the most part, that's not the experience that authors have. Their audience is comprised of people who are interested in what they're writing and in who they are, and in helping them and in helping improve their books.
I will say, for me, I have been terrified on occasions for various reasons. Maybe I'm inserting my opinion and it's a controversial one, or maybe it's just like, it's something that, it's something that's not talked about a lot. I'm worried about getting it wrong. For me, getting feedback from readers has actually helped with that, because it's like somebody's checking me, and I like that. I like that. If somebody's going to call me on it, and I'm on the web. I get to change it. And that's actually, I'm talking about LeanPub. That's another nice thing, is like, I can always issue a correction and send out an email to all my readers and be like, sorry, I'm very sorry, but it's updated now, and you can kind of get the newest version here.
The last question I like to ask on this podcast is, if there was anything we could build for you or anything we could fix for you, is there anything that comes to mind?
So, I feel like early on I think there is a way to sort of import directly from WordPress. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do remember not having a good experience with that. And I basically I'm a programmer. So I created a script that converted all of my posts to Markdown and just kind of did it that way. But having a way to, programmatically, I understand how complicated it is, but to crawl a site and pick which articles you want and possibly even rearrange them and just import them that way, that would be kind of a dream, I think.
Thanks very much for that. It's not exactly flashbacks, but it's inspiring me. But LeanPub actually started out as a blog to book service.
Okay.
The first book was Startup Lessons Learned by Eric Ries, from Eric Ries's pre-lean startup days. So we importing from blogs is actually not something that we've touched in a long time, because we've sort of just become focused over the years on building other tools. But I'll definitely communicate to the team that this is an area that now is maybe has a few cobwebs around it that we might want to improve. So thank you very much, Jay, for taking the time to do this interview, and for your amazing newsletter and for your book. And all the best for a great 2019.
Great. Thanks for having me. And it was a blast.
Thanks very much.